Thank you, Daniel, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I have to say, as someone who left a very wet and cloudy Oregon this morning with my son Joshua over here, I am honored that you all are inside on a day like today, which to us just seems like a spectacular day, so we'll try to make it worth your while. We're going to be talking about religious liberty today. I want to begin, though, with the focus on the American founding, and I want to use a purposely provocative question that I think will help us frame the discussion. And then I want to turn specifically to religious liberty and church state in the American founding. But I want to begin with the question, did America have a Christian founding? And this is a question that scholars and popular authors debate quite a bit, as it turns out. Among scholars, there's a pretty profound commitment to the answer, of course not. Of course, America did not have a Christian founding. The American founders were deists that wanted the strict separation of church and state. Maybe there were a few religious folks among them, but really the nation was experimenting with Enlightenment politics, and we're going in a very different direction than where we had come from. I'll just give you one quote. I've collected about 25 quotes like this from very prominent scholars. I'll give you one from Jeffrey Stone, a very prominent law professor at the University of Chicago, who argues that deistic beliefs played a central role in the founding of the American Republic. The founding generation viewed religion, and particularly religion's relation to government, through an Enlightenment lens that was deeply skeptical of Orthodox Christianity. And I could give you quotes along these lines from Edwin Gostin, Stephen Waldman, Richard Hughes, Stephen Keeler, David Holmes, Brooke Allen, and many others. And so I could suggest that these folks have a narrative. They have a narrative they tell that the founders were deists. They wanted the strict separation of church and state. Maybe some were private in an individual capacity, but in terms of the Union, they certainly wanted to create, in the words of Cranach and Moore, a godless constitution. And so we had a secular founding. Now there's a second answer that's pretty prevalent as well among popular authors, particularly popular Christian authors, and I have in mind here people like Peter Marshall, David Manuel, John Eidsmoe, Tim LaHaye, Gary Amos, and others. And what these folks say is, of course, America had a Christian founding. Maybe even an evangelical founding. It was a profoundly Christian founding. And what these folks do is they go around and they collect quotations. And if they find a quotation that seems religious, seems to acknowledge God, even if it's from someone like Benjamin Franklin, who in many respects is very skeptical, at least throughout most of his life, but he suggests a call for prayer, that we have prayer in the Constitutional Convention. Boom, all of a sudden, Ben Franklin now is in the Christian founding. So you have two very different answers that, again, are very popular. In the Academy, I think the predominant answer is we had a very secular founding that wanted the strict separation of church and state. Among popular Christian authors, you have a fairly uncritical argument that says we had a profoundly Christian founding. And so what I want to do is I want to investigate this question. I want to investigate it first by asking, what do we mean by the question? What would a Christian founding look like? What would it constitute? What would the founding have to be in order for us to say it was Christian? Now, there's a couple of different ways we could answer this question. The first way is simply that Americans at the time were Christians. And if that's what we mean, then absolutely we had a Christian founding. In the late 18th century, Americans of European descent, white Americans, were overwhelmingly Christian. 99.99% were Christian. There were about 1,000 Jews in America at the time, and they're the only outliers outside the Christian tradition. Moreover, about 97% of Americans were Protestants. So you could even say that we had a Protestant founding, if by that we simply mean how did these folks identify themselves. But I don't think that's a very useful or interesting or profound finding. We might go a step further and say, well, not only did they identify themselves as Christians, they were, in fact, sincere Christians. But this becomes very, very difficult for the historian or the student of history to get at. I mean, frankly, you don't know if the person you sit by in the pew on Sunday is a sincere Christian. They might just simply be there to make connections or because it's expected or whatever else. How are you going to judge their sincerity? You can certainly say this person's a church member, maybe a leader within the church, a Sunday school teacher, but again, particularly as someone who spent time in the buckle of the Bible Belt, I can tell you just because someone is in church, maybe even an elder, we don't necessarily know if they're sincere. So I think that's not a very useful way to frame the question, and it's hard to say anything really about almost any of these folks. Maybe some through diaries and other means we could get at that, but many we just simply don't have records. Well, a third possibility, which is related but a bit different, is that they were Orthodox Christians. We could emphasize this, that they were in fact not deists. Now again, this is difficult to prove in many instances, but I do want to make this assertion. We can come back to it. I've looked very carefully at a wide range of founders, and pretty much what I've come up with is I can find two founders where we have good solid evidence that they are in fact deists. Okay, they claim to be deists, they argued deistical things. There are another handful of founders that were clearly heterodox. They embraced a couple of heterodox ideas. Thomas Jefferson would fall into this category, a couple of others, and yet they were very quiet about this embracing of heterodoxy, and they certainly recognized it would be political suicide for them to reveal it. With respect to most founders, from what we can see from the textual evidence, including founders like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others that are routinely thrown in this deistic category, you just can't, it's difficult to find clear evidence that they were in fact deists. So for all these scholars that claim that most of the American founders were deists, I want to say, where's your evidence? We just simply don't have this evidence. And on the other hand, with many founders, from Roger Sherman to James Wilson to Samuel Adams to Patrick Henry, we can get a pretty good idea that these folks were Orthodox Christians, at least in terms of what they wrote, espoused, and so forth. But again, I'm still not sure it's the most interesting way to approach the question. And another approach that Christian historians have made a lot of hay with is orthopraxy. Did they act as Christians? And this becomes interesting because oftentimes the folks that argue the founders were deists, they might not be able to have evidence that they were in fact deists, but they say, oh look, Alexander Hamilton had an affair. That's not Christian behavior, therefore we can put him in this heterodox category. Well, I want to suggest there's a mistake going on here, because no one has ever argued, and if they had, they're wrong, that Christians are perfect. Everyone recognizes that Christians struggle with the old man within. Christians can have affairs. It's wrong, it's morally wrong, of course, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one is not a Christian simply because one acts immorally. Now, of course, if there's a long ongoing pattern of such activity, one could say, well, you know, this is pretty problematic at least. Even worse so is oftentimes an argument will go like this. Well, the founders didn't immediately abolish slavery. And obviously a Christian statesperson would see this grave moral wrong staring them in the face and act on it. But I want to suggest we need to be real careful, particularly with the benefit of historical hindsight. It seems pretty difficult to imagine how anyone could support the institution of chattel slavery, and yet we need to be real careful playing this game, right? You can imagine 200 years from now, people will look back on their own era and say people who didn't support nationalized health care, a Christian politician who didn't support nationalized health care, how could that person have actually been a Christian? Well, the reality is, of course, Christians can disagree on matters of public policy, and what seems morally clear to one generation may not be so morally clear later. So I want to suggest we need to be very careful going down this path. In my mind, the best way, the most legitimate way to explore the question is, were the American founders influenced by Christian ideas? Okay? Historians, students of the American founding, spend a lot of time talking about this sort of question. Were the founders influenced by Lockean liberalism? Were they influenced by classical republicanism? Were they influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment? And by the same token, I think we can reasonably say, were they influenced by Christian ideas? And let's look at the evidence and see what we can come up with. And we might conclude, in fact, that even someone who had an affair might still have been influenced by Christian ideas when it came time to build a constitution or resist Great Britain. And by the same token, we actually might find that someone who is even clearly not a Christian still could have been influenced by Christian ideas. All right, so that's how I'm going to approach the question. I do want to take a step back, and because all along you've probably been assuming, and it's a very reasonable assumption, that I'm talking about folks in the late 18th century. So if we begin by saying what would constitute a Christian founding, with the emphasis on Christian, my argument there is an influence by Christian ideas. I now want to turn briefly to what constitutes the American founding, because some have argued, Gary DeMar and others, that really the nation begins not in 1776, but more than 150 years earlier with the early colonies, the nation's first colonies. So I want to begin by considering this possibility of what we might mean by founding, and look and see if we can say this is in fact a Christian event. Move forward then to 1776, our break with Great Britain, and then turning finally to the Constitution. I want to explore each of these periods and then dive into religious liberty and church-state relations. All right, so let's press on here. Very few people doubt that the Puritans were engaged in what they took to be a Christian event, that they were, in the words of Governor Winthrop, attempting to create a shiny city on a hill. They incorporated passages from the Old Testament into their codes. Clearly they were about creating a Christian commonwealth. They might have been wrong in certain respects. I'm certainly not saying they were right, but at least in terms of their intent, when we look at the laws, the statutes, the constitutions, we get a sense that these folks were trying their best to bring Christian ideas to bear on matters of public concern, on law, on governance. However, America was a big place, and it's oftentimes the case that people say, well, yeah, fine, that was New England. What about the South? John Fea, I see his book right there, says that, well, when you look at Jamestown, you see that the real appeal of Jamestown was economic opportunity and the very real possibility of striking it rich. And so this is oftentimes the dichotomy that's made, right? Yeah, maybe those Puritans were religious, but in the South it was all about economic opportunity. I want to suggest that, first of all, I think people came to New England for economic opportunity, and folks who came to the South oftentimes were, in fact, concerned with Christianity. I could give a variety of evidences of this, but I think what I'll do is just read a little bit from Virginia's 1610 Legal Code, which begins like this. Whereas His Majesty, like himself, a most zealous prince, has in his own realms a principal care of true religion and reverence to God, and has always strictly commanded his generals and governors with all his horses whatsoever to let their ways be like their ends for the glory of God. The legal code goes on to say that these folks are embarked on a sacred cause. This is Jamestown, keep in mind, to mandate regular church attendance and to say that one will be put to death if one denies the Trinity or commits blasphemy. Now we see this again throughout most of the colonies, including Quaker, Pennsylvania. I'm from George Fox University. It's a Friend school, a Quaker school. We're very proud of how liberal and tolerant early Pennsylvania was, and it was in certain respects. And yet sometimes I'm able to surprise my friends by how intolerant these Quakers could be. In fact, the Charter of Pennsylvania begins by quoting Romans 13. And Romans 38 has a really fun list of things that the government in tolerant Quaker Pennsylvania could properly punish. Offenses against God, and they are called offenses against God, such as swearing, cursing, lying, profane talk, drunkenness, obscene words, incest, sodomy, stage plays, cards, dice, masks, revels. The list goes on and on. May games, cockfighting, bear baiting, and the like, which excite the people to rudeness, cruelty, looseness, and irreligion. And if you go throughout the colonies in this area, you're going to see this sort of thing time and time again, from New England to Pennsylvania to the South. Most of these states had religious tests for office. Most of them had established churches. At least 9 of them had established churches. And so it seems to me, if we say America was founded in the early 17th century in these early colonial settlements, and a plausible argument can be made for that, you could say absolutely. You can make a very, very strong case that we had a Christian founding, that these folks were drawing from Christian ideas as they built political institutions, civil society, laws, and so forth. Let me move us to the War for Independence, because this creates a problem, right? It presents an immediate problem, because it would seem just on the surface to fly in the face of Romans 13, which of course says that government is ordained by God and Christians must be subject to these governments. And historically, Christian thinkers, Christian theologians have said for more or less 1600 years that what a Christian must do is submit to whatever government is in authority over him, over her. That if the authority tells you to disobey God, you of course have to refuse to do so, but then you take the consequence. There is no right of revolution. However, and this is true for 1600 years. However, you had this little thing that came along known as the Protestant Reformation. And oftentimes when people talk about the Protestant Reformation, they focus like a laser beam on John Calvin. And of course, his Institutes is a wonderful work, and it lays out a variety of key doctrines. But what is critical to understand, and John Fea gets this wrong too, I have to say, is that John Calvin does not represent the Reformed political tradition. He is by far and away the most conservative of all of the Reformed thinkers in this era. Well, there's one other that comes close when it comes to resisting political authority. Calvin says in the Institutes that there may be occasions where an inferior magistrate could resist a superior magistrate. However, almost right away, even as Calvin is living, you have John Knox up in Scotland saying, no, the people have a right and responsibility to resist an ungodly magistrate. And you have others, George Buchanan, Samuel Rutherford, Stephenus Junius Brutus, Theodore Beza, Christopher Goodman, John Ponet, again arguing that it's a requirement of faith that ungodly, unjust rulers, and they did use unjust, it wasn't simply ungodly, that they must be resisted. So this becomes a very important part of Reformed political thought, and it's a Reformed tradition that absolutely dominates in the American colonies. We can push all the way forward to 1776. According to Harry Stout, according to Sidney Ellstrom, 1776, 75% of Americans are in the Reformed tradition, can be reasonably classified as being in the Reformed tradition. And so when these folks thought about revolution, they understood Romans 13, but they also understood that their tradition taught them that they had a Christian duty, a Christian obligation to resist an ungodly or unjust government. The British, incidentally, saw this as well. And of course, you're probably aware that of quotations like the loyalist Peter Oliver, who railed against the black regiment, the dissenting clergy, by which he meant the Congregationalists, Presbyterians primarily, who took so active a part of the rebellion. King George himself reputedly referred to the War for Independence as a Presbyterian rebellion. One of my favorite cartoons here is this one. You can see one of the issues, and this is oftentimes overlooked. If you study the American Revolution by looking real hard at the Declaration of Independence, by looking at taxation, those are issues. One of the preeminent issues of the day was the fear that a bishop would be sent to America. And you can see here the idea is that bishop's been sent over and he's being chased away there. And a variety of things are being tossed at him, including Locke, Cindy, and the book about to hit him in the head is the works of John Calvin, Calvin's works. All right. So I want to argue that, I want to suggest that the Reformed tradition, I think, heavily influenced these folks in this respect. When you look at one of our most well-known documents, I don't think it's the best, because if you look at other documents protesting the British abuses, they oftentimes talk about the Quebec Act, they talk about the bishop, they talk about rallying Protestants to their side. The Declaration of Independence is somewhat different. It's aimed at an international audience, specifically at France, but perhaps others. But when you think about the key normative claim of that document, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, of course, you could say, wait a minute, we all know that the guy who drafted that was Thomas Jefferson, and he's a deist. Well, first of all, I'm not sure he's a deist, because he talks about God intervening in the affairs of men and nations, which, at least by most high school definitions of deism, you aren't a deist if you believe that God does miracles, that he helps you out or hinders you. He clearly is heterodox. There's no question about that. We know that from private letters written primarily in the 19th century. But I think it's critical to recognize that Jefferson did indeed do a draft of the Declaration of Independence. It was gone over by the Committee of Five, which included Roger Sherman, an old Puritan, if there ever was one. And then it went to the Continental Congress, who, of course, changed it around in ways that Jefferson didn't like. Jefferson, in fact, later in life, wrote specifically to Richard Henry Lee to say, the Declaration of Independence wasn't my attempt to come up with anything new. It was to distill the sentiments of the time. And so I think we can't understand the Declaration of Independence simply through the eyes of Jefferson. Well, let's move on to the Constitution, and now we're getting to what we might need to focus on a bit, because the Constitution, intriguingly enough, is a godless document, particularly if you compare the Constitution to early state constitutions, charters, and this sort of thing. God is strangely absent from the U.S. Constitution. The name of the deity appears only once in the date line in the year of our Lord, 1787. And moreover, Article 6 goes on to prohibit religious tests for office, for federal office. Now, this is surprising. Again, almost every state at this time, with two exceptions, had religious tests for office. And so you could say, okay, gosh, this is perhaps a godless document. There are a few allusions to Christianity. There's an assumption that the legislature won't meet on Sunday, but these are thin reeds to rest upon. All right, so I think on the surface, there's a plausible argument going on here. You could say, yeah, perhaps there is an attempt to go in a very different direction. And some founders might have wanted to go this direction. I think one of the problems we have when we study the American founding is we're drawn, and scholars particularly are drawn to these geniuses, these well-educated geniuses, like a Thomas Jefferson, a John Adams, Ben Franklin. But what we need to recognize is these folks are outliers. These are very, very different from many of their colleagues. They had spent a lot of time in Europe. Ben Franklin spent more than half of the last 35 years of his life in Europe. He's not a representative American on these things. What I think is much more useful is if we broaden the scope and we look at founders more generally and the sort of things the founders did, we see a very, very different picture. And what you can argue is that, again, I think even in the American founding, even in the drafting of the Constitution, Christianity played an important role, and I'm going to give you 5 ways in which I think this is the case. But let me give you 2 arguments real quickly. One of my favorite scholars in this area is Barry Allen Shane at Koch. He had a wonderful book in 1994, The Myth of American Individualism, The Protestant Origins of American Political Thought. And he makes arguments very similar to what I make, and he makes them in a variety of venues. And people inevitably will say to him, aha, you're just one of those Christian Reconstructionists or something like that. And he'll say, no, I'm an agnostic Jew. I have no bone in this fight, no dog in this fight. I'm not interested in it, just I look at the evidence, and this is what I find. It's a great book. I commend it to you, even though it's a little bit old. It's one of those books that simply doesn't date. As well, there's a famous study that I think is really quite enlightening. Donald Lutz, a political scientist, did a content analysis of the political literature of the American founding. Lutz actually does not include political sermons that don't cite secular thinkers. So the numbers actually would be significantly different if you included all political literature. So he focuses only on some. He does have some political sermons, though. He looked at 15,000 articles, pamphlets, books, and so forth. And he looked, who are these guys citing? What are they quoting? And what you can see is that the Bible, by far and away, is the most cited book, the works of all Enlightenment thinkers combined. So not just John Locke, but the whole range of them are significantly behind that. You can see these things do come and go. Jennifer was very kind to list some of the books that I've been involved in. Some of them are edited. One of the things we've done that I'm actually quite pleased with is in attempting to broaden the conversation. My friend Daniel Dreisbach and Jeffrey Morrison and I have edited 2 books, and then Dreisbach and I have another one coming out. We're profiling something like 35 of the American founders. And what you see is when you look at a wide range of these folks, that really Jefferson and Madison really are quite the outliers here, Franklin and Paine. They're very unrepresentative of others. Again, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Roger Sherman, George Mason, John Jay, Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren. The list goes on and on and on. When you look at most of these, and we get the best scholars we can find to write on these, some Christian, some not, it doesn't matter. And what you find when you broaden the conversation, most of these folks give every evidence of being a sincere, pious Christian who uses the Bible in political rhetoric, who seems to draw from Christian ideas, uses Christian ideas to do things such as define liberty. Well, let me give you a couple of arguments here. First of all, let me say, I should deal with this objection first, and then we'll push on. Why is God not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution? And I think it's because of an idea that we've forgotten about 60-some years ago, and that is that we have a federal republic. The American founders thought almost to a person that to the extent to which government is going to be involved in shaping moral character, in promoting religion, that this must be the local government, the state government or local governments. It's not the business in the national government. The national government is being put together for certain very limited ends, right? National defense, post office, regulation of interstate commerce, and taking care of religion is not one of those things. So it's a principle of federalism. An analogy I've used, and I think this works pretty well. I imagine some of your parents are business persons, and I trust very godly business persons that bring their faith into everything they do. Well, I would suggest if you go and look at their articles of incorporations for their restaurants or software companies or whatever, these articles of incorporation might not be filled with Bible verses and religious language, right? So that's a very specific document for a specific purpose, and it might not be the place for such rhetoric. States, on the other hand, that's a role, according to the founders, if they're going to be involved, and we're going to see that some are thinking maybe Christianity is best served when the state isn't involved, but if they're going to be involved, it's going to be at the state level. And of course, they remain in this business for a while. The last established church is not disestablished until 1832, but long after that, states retained religious tests for office, gave money to religious institutions. When public schools came along, they had prayer in the public schools, Bible reading, and this sort of thing. And I'm not arguing these things are appropriate or good or great public policy for today. I'm just saying historically, this is the way it played out, and the American founders were very, very happy with that. All right, so let's talk about it. I want to give you 5 ways. I could keep going on and on and on about it, but I'll give you a couple ways in which I think the American founders were influenced by Christianity. Probably one of the most important is that their faith taught them that all men are sinful, and even redeemed Christians are struggling with the old man within. And as such, they would have agreed with Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they designed a constitutional system with separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. This was very conscious of them, and it's very opposite to Enlightenment thought at the time, particularly continental Enlightenment thought, which said this. They said, look, what we need is a government by the experts in a very concentrated form. We can't trust the local yokels in the provinces. We need the governments and the experts in Paris to have a strong, centralized national government without the separation of powers, because they get in the way, right? So, you know, Tom Paine wanted a unicameral legislature. Pennsylvania fooled around with it a little bit, but that's because it's full of Quakers and other folks like that. Reformed people didn't see it that way, right? No, we got to be very suspicious of concentrated powers. And of course, the system they designed is very much representing that. They believed almost to a person, as far as I can tell, that God had created moral standards and that governmental laws should be in accord with these moral standards. A great evidence of this is James Wilson's Lectures on Law. If you haven't looked at them, you should. Wilson is one of the best educated of the American founders, and he's one that lays out a clear philosophy. Unlike most founders who were so busy doing things. He gave a series of law lectures at what is now the University of Pennsylvania, and when you read them, literally you think you're reading St. Thomas Aquinas. He talks about divine law and positive law, different types of divine law. He specifically says a human law that contradicts divine natural law is void. As you would expect, every single Supreme Court justice, with one exception prior to John Marshall, said that if Congress passed a statute that violates natural law, the U.S. Supreme Court could declare that statute to be void. So this is before Marbury versus Madison. Every single justice except for James Iredell is clearly on record as saying that. All right, as well, Christianity informed their understandings of notions like liberty. What is liberty? All the founders distinguished between liberty and license, between licentiousness. Liberty is a freedom to do what is right. Barry Allen Shane shows 8 different ways in which liberty was used in the era. Only one of them is a contemporary definition of liberty that most of us as Westerners, particularly Americans, have, which is that I'm free to do whatever I want until I physically harm someone else. Almost no one in this era had that definition of liberty. Far more common would be, again, I'll quote Wilson, who said that law without liberty is tyranny, but liberty without law is licentiousness. And again, at a very deep level, I think the notion that we're all created in the image of God. This was powerfully important. We're capable of ordering our lives together. People should be treated with dignity. Certainly it took some time for them to work out the implications of this with respect to things like slavery. But again, sometimes we have a faulty view in this respect. I think a number of founders were troubled by this. That's why between 1776 and 1806 or so, something like 7 states abolished slavery, usually through gradual manumission. But still, the reasons were it's wrong. It violates basic human dignity and equality, and we ought to do away with this institution. All right, so let's turn to the topic of the day, and I think this was all relevant to the topic of the day, but specifically I want to focus in on religious liberty, church-state relations. This is more than an abstract discussion here. 1947 in Everson versus the Board of Education, both Hugo Black and Wiley Rutledge, in majority and dissenting opinions, said we have to understand the religion clauses in light of the founders' views. No other constitutional provision is as informed by the founders' views as this particular clause. However, both of them offered a very distorted view of the American founders, because both of them argued that basically Thomas Jefferson and James Madison represent the American founders. And moreover, we can pick out a couple of key documents. Really just 4 documents are all we need. The Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, the Memorial and Remonstrance, and the detached memorandum. And that's all we need. But of course, if you know anything about this era, you cannot do any worse cherry picking. These are very unrepresentative documents in many respects. There are plenty of other documents one could look at. There's religious liberty statutes in every state, and I'll give you some examples as we press on. I think for 40 or so years, these assertions in Everson were allowed to rule, and they were rarely challenged on the court. And scholars immediately, Edwin Corwin said, this is crazy, this is not the case at all. But again, they tended to reign in the academy. Beginning in the 1980s with William Rehnquist and a variety of scholars, I think now there's a recognition that, well, maybe these aren't representative of all the American founders. And so what you see now, you see this among Supreme Court justices and scholars both, is they say, well, history's messy. Some founders wanted the separation of church and state, others wanted establishments. It's just all so messy, we can't really come up with what the founders wanted. And so we have to go to other resources. Well, I want to suggest that this is simply not the case. I think there are three areas of consensus that we can talk about with respect to the American founders. And of course, there's going to be outliers, but still, there's consensuses, right? You can talk about how African Americans vote in presidential elections. There's outliers, but we can say with pretty profound confidence that, look, 90+% of African Americans are going to vote for the Democratic candidate for president, no matter who he or she is. We need to know that, and to simply say, well, some African Americans are conservatives, some are liberals, some are Republicans, some are Democrats, that would be a misleading statement, right? All right, so what are these areas of consensus? Well, the first is, by this area, almost everyone agreed that religious liberty had to be protected, that the state shouldn't be telling people how to worship God, whether to worship God or not to worship God, certainly. A great representation of this, and this document, incidentally, is far more influential than any of the other documents I mentioned in the era. It was George Mason's Article 16 that was reprinted, that was adopted in other states. And what he argued is this, that as religion, or the duty which we owe our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Note here, incidentally, that religious liberty is grounded in a duty to God. It's not grounded in reason, or certainly reason alone. It's not governed by postmodernism. Well, people think different things about religion, so let's just live and let live. Now, James Madison, it's true, stood up and objected to the word toleration. He wanted it to be crystal clear that religious liberty is a right. Mason agreed to this, and Article 16 eventually had that language. By the end of the Revolutionary era, every single state had either a statute or constitutional protection provision protecting religious liberty. There's still debates. What exactly were these aimed at protecting? Did they require an exemption from a neutrally applicable law? We can argue about that. People have spilled a lot of ink over that, but clearly it means, at least according to James Madison, with respect to the First Amendment, that Congress cannot pass any law making men worship God in a manner contrary to their conscience. Okay, so this is, I think, something we need to recognize. Perhaps the only thing I'd add to this discussion is I think for most founders, it was based on a Christian commitment, on an understanding of the golden rule, not some notion of Enlightenment reason. Well, a little more interesting and perhaps controversial, I want to suggest this. When it came to religious establishments, there is a disagreement of opinion, but I think there is a consensus. And I want to state the consensus like this, that states should have established churches only if these churches protect and promote true religion. All right, so think about that. States should have established churches only if these churches protect and promote true religion. Now, Americans, of course, are familiar with what it means to have an established church. England had an established church, still has an established church, for that matter, right? At least 9 of the states had established churches. In the 1770s, of course, some states are rethinking the wisdom of this. And the first to go, of course, are the Anglican Church, the Church of England in America, right? As you might imagine, this was pretty unpopular during the War for Independence when we're fighting the head of the Anglican Church. And as well, you have these waves of immigration of Scottish Presbyterians and others. So in the South, where the church tended to be established, you're getting far more diverse. And so a variety of movements arose that got rid of the established churches within the South. In the North, however, what you tended to have was this. You tended to have a shift towards multiple or plural establishments. So when Roger Sherman helped revise the Connecticut statutes in 1783, for instance, he wrote his own religious liberty statute, And he also provided and helped work with others, of course, to come up with a series of multiple establishments that basically said this: if you're a Quaker, if you're a Baptist, if you're a Mennonite, and you just don't want the state to have anything to do with religion, fine, you're exempted. Otherwise, we're going to tax you to support the church you choose to attend. Okay? Now, it's true, atheists are basically left out in the cold. I'm not sure there were any Jews in the state and the regions. I'm not sure it's an issue. And Catholics, again, I think there were a handful, and they might have been taxed to support the default congregational church. But basically, even Connecticut and Massachusetts and these others moved towards a series of multiple establishments. What's fun, though, and this is fun, and again, we miss out on this if all we do is read the Memorial and Remonstrance in the Virginia Statute. The Memorial and Remonstrance is great. We'll talk about it in a minute. But far more common is an argument that I ran across from Westmoreland County. I actually came across two sets of petitions that were received by the Virginia legislature on the same day. The first one is kind of fun because it sounds like the sort of arguments that you hear routinely from public sector unions today. The first one was in favor of a religious establishment. They said, look, the state has to be involved in funding religion because if it isn't, then ministers won't get paid a good salary and they'll go into other professions. They'll become teachers or lawyers or attorneys or something like that. So we must have state involvement in funding religion. All right. Well, here's an excerpt from the most popular petition in the era. Virginia, the legislature received about 90 petitions signed by about 9,000 people or so. 5,000 signed this petition, this very evangelical petition that argued, they said clergy, responding to clergy, they shouldn't be motivated by money. They should manifest to the world that they are inwardly moved by the Holy Ghost to take upon that office, that they seek the good of mankind and not worldly interest. Let their doctrines be scriptural, their lives upright, then shall religion, if departed, speedily return, and deism be put to open shame, and its dreaded consequences removed. They go on to say basically when Constantine first established Christianity, that was the beginning of our downward slope. We need to get the state out of the business of supporting Christianity, of having an established church, simply and solely because it hurts true religion. It's bad for religion. It's bad for Christianity. That's why we don't want the state involved. Again, this was far more popular than Madison's petition, which is oftentimes read as a secular argument. But if you read through Madison's petition, and he might have done this out of sincerity, he might have done it for rhetorical effect, but it doesn't matter. If he did it for rhetorical effect, he thought it would be effective. In the memorial, Madison argues that ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation, and that the bill, Patrick Henry's bill, is adverse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity. All right, so what I'm suggesting here is that America's founders were not anti-Christian. The only argument with respect to establishments was, does it benefit true religion? If it does, we should have them. If it doesn't, we shouldn't. All right? Well, the very last issue I'll move to then is religion in the public square. We hear a lot about this. Was not America founded on the idea of a wall of separation between church and state, a wall that should keep religion out of the public square, that we should engage in civil discourse with public reason and this sort of thing. This metaphor, of course, comes from a famous letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist, in which he in fact did say that the amendment requires a wall of separation between church and state. It's not always known that with respect to Establishment Clause jurisprudence, this metaphor lay dormant until 1947, where both Hugo Black and Wiley Rutledge said, okay, this is how we have to understand the Establishment Clause. It requires a wall of separation between church and state. What I want to suggest, though, particularly with respect to religion in the public square, is it really distorts the founders' views in numerous ways. To begin with, I'll point out, as you all are probably aware, Jefferson had nothing to do with drafting or ratifying the First Amendment. He was over in Europe at the time, so I'm not sure why we would look to him in any case. But moreover, let's just focus on Jefferson for a minute. Thomas Jefferson issued calls for prayer and fasting when he was governor of Virginia. In his revisions of Virginia statutes, he drafted bills stipulating when the governor could appoint days for public fasting and humiliation. And Thomas Jefferson drafted a bill to punish folks who disturb religious worship or the Sabbath. One thing this suggests, incidentally, is again, it goes back to my point of federalism, and Jefferson later says this, to the extent to which any civic entity should support religion, it should be the state, not the national government. So perhaps Jefferson on these matters is motivated by federalism. Now, he did want a stricter separation between church and state than most founders, but even he, as governor, was willing to do these things. Perhaps more interesting at the national level, here is what Thomas Jefferson proposed for our national seal. He was on a committee with Ben Franklin and John Adams. Franklin had a very similar seal. It would have Moses on it, extending his hand over the sea, causing it to overwhelm Pharaoh. And the motto for the United States, if Thomas Jefferson had had his way, would be rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. All right, he closed his second inaugural address by encouraging Americans to join him in seeking the favor of that being, in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old. Now here's what's really sort of mind-boggling from the strictest of separationist perspective. 2 days after he penned the letter to the Danbury Baptist, he went to the U.S. Capitol building, which was routinely used for religious services in this era. In the U.S. Capitol building, he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister and himself an opponent of religious establishments. So Jefferson didn't like religious establishments, Leland didn't like religious establishments, but apparently neither of them thought it was inappropriate to use a U.S. Capitol for a religious service. So what I want to suggest to you, I am not arguing that Jefferson wanted a close cooperation between church and state. What I'm arguing is that even Jefferson isn't the sort of strict separationist that the U.S. Supreme Court, at least some justices would have us believe. And what Jefferson maybe wasn't completely consistent on, most founders didn't even think was an issue. Most founders had no problem with religion in the public square. Again, a great example of this is the First Federal Congress. The First Federal Congress, it was a tough going, in a couple of days, it's one of these interesting coincidences again, a couple of days after the House passed the final version of the First Amendment, Elias Boudinot had a great idea. That's the fellow in the middle there. Elias Boudinot, who went on later to help found the American Bible Society, said, hey, I have a great idea. Why don't we ask President Washington to issue a call for Thanksgiving? And Adonias Burke of North Carolina said, oh, we can't do that. That's a European sort of practice. To which Roger Sherman, the old Puritan, said, no, it's fine. It's a biblical practice, not a European practice. And they had a debate, and Sherman and Boudinot won. The House suggested to the Senate that they ask George Washington to issue a call for Thanksgiving. The Senate agreed, and George Washington issued his famous Thanksgiving Day Proclamation of 1789. Which said, and I won't read the whole thing, some of it's worth reading though, whereas it is the duty of nations to acknowledge the providence of God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly implore His protection and favor. He does implore prayer, and also that we may unite most humbly in offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech Him to pardon our national and other transgressions. Now, almost all presidents, including the current one, issue calls for Thanksgiving. It is telling, though, how robust, really, George Washington is. If you look at the Continental Confederation Congress, you have a number of these documents, about 18 or so. Washington did them, Adams did them, Madison did them. Jefferson, it's true, didn't do them. Perhaps for First Amendment concerns, perhaps for 10th Amendment concerns. It's not crystal clear. But again, most presidents have done that. What I want to suggest, though, is there is a consensus here. The American founders did not want an established church at the national level. That much is clear. And that is largely what the Establishment Clause means. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. They were not attempting to build a high wall of separation between church and state, to remove religion from the public square, and this sort of thing. All right, so by way of conclusion, let me just throw a couple of ideas up, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers or objections. I'm happy to have the objections. So if we focus on the question for a minute, did America have a Christian founding? I think we have to recognize it's a complicated question. We want to look at the question, be sure of what we mean by it. But I would say there certainly is a great deal of evidence that, in fact, the founders were not deists who wanted to create a secular constitutional republic and strictly separate church and state. And I think we can make a very good idea that they were profoundly influenced in important ways by Christian ideas. So if that's what we mean by Christian founding, I think we can say a clear yes. Let me hasten to say, what does this mean for Americans who are non-Christians? Well, I think clearly the American founders designed a constitutional order for folks besides Christians. They recognized there were non-Christians out there, that non-Christians would come. This came up in the ratification debates, right? When Article 6 was discussed, some folks were bothered by the lack of a federal test. They said, oh, this could lead to a Muslim being president, what else? A couple other, a Jew, certainly an atheist. So this was recognized and rejected. They recognized this was a constitutional republic that would be open for all. George Washington, in his wonderful letter to the Hebrew synagogue in Newport, said, look, this country is open for all who are going to fulfill their duties as citizens. And so I think we need to recognize and emphasize that. And yet it doesn't follow from this openness that we should de-emphasize our nation's Christian roots, just as a matter of intellectual honesty, if nothing else. As well, I think it's important to revisit first principles. Some of these ideas are pretty important ideas, and I think we lose a lot if we abandon them. The idea is that humans are created in the image of God and should be treated with dignity and respect because of that. A recognition that religious arguments have a place in the public square, that this certainly isn't unconstitutional and doesn't go against the views of the American founders. I think the notion that there should be a connection between law and morality is something the founders teach us. That is useful to remember in this day and age where some justices, some state courts have said basically legislatures have no business taking morality into account when passing statutes. So these are some of the lessons that I think we could pull out of this. Real quick, First Amendment lessons. I think we can say the First Amendment, clearly the Free Exercise Clause is intended to protect a pretty wide scope of religious liberty. And I think we have, again, a great deal of evidence to suggest that the Establishment Clause is not requiring a strict separation of church and state. Now, what is prudential in 21st century America might be very different from what was prudential in late 18th century America. So don't hear me calling for prayer in public schools or this sort of thing. But just from a constitutional perspective, I think we need to have an accurate view. If we're going to go to the American founders to define what the Establishment Clause means, we need to have an accurate view of what they actually believed. And so with that, I will stop. I suggested, there's different things you can mean, right? We can mean that the American population at the time was Christian. If we limited that to white Americans, overwhelmingly so, right? So the people would identify themselves as Christians. I just don't find that very interesting, right? Christians could be profoundly influenced by non-Christian ideas, for instance. So I think the best way, the most approachable way, and the most significant, the most meaningful way to approach the question is in terms of influence. Can we argue that the American founders were influenced by Christian ideas? And the answer is, I think we can make a very good argument that Christian ideas had a very important role. There were other ideas floating around, including some ideas that might be incompatible with Christianity. But yeah, I think this is an oft-neglected influence on the American founders. But when I look at the American founding, I have to say that I think Scalia was right in that opinion with respect to his interpreting the American founding. I don't think the American founders intended the Free Exercise Clause to require an exemption from otherwise neutral laws. All right, so it's one of those things, right, where I have to say I think history pretty clearly teaches that, even though I like exemptions. And I think America's at its best when we make exemptions for religious minorities. At the same time, I'll say the American founders understood about exceptions and they consciously made them. In what became the Second Amendment, the original version of that had an exemption for religious pacifists. In the Militia Act of 1789, James Madison and Roger Sherman both pushed for an exemption for religious pacifists. And you see this at the state level as well. So clearly, legislatures can make exemptions, as Oregon fortunately did after the Smith case. Oregon passed an exemption, as the national government has done. I don't think the Free Exercise Clause requires it. Let me take your question in a slightly different direction. I do think, by far and away, the greatest threat to religious liberty that's going to come in your lifetimes, you students out here, are going to be by state and maybe national laws that are neutral, that are aimed at either hate speech or discrimination. And we see this in CLS versus Martinez, right? A case out of the University of California at Hastings, where the University of California at Hastings pretty much said we're going to allow 72, 76 student organizations to meet, but not the Christian Legal Society because it discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation. And that's a little bluntly put, but more or less that's what was said. Yeah, so that's, and that's very unfortunate. I'm not sure, gosh, I sure would think, and you could look at the history of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech cases and say, gosh, shouldn't CLS have a pretty compelling argument even just under that line of jurisprudence? But yeah, that's going to be a threat. That's a very real threat. I would define the Apostles' Creed with with Chesterton as, I'm sorry, orthodoxy, I would define as the Apostles' Creed as understood by all Christians at every place, every time, until about the 20th century, right? So, the basic idea of, God exists, the Trinity, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, Jesus Christ died for our sins, and so forth. So basic Apostles' Creed Christianity. So when you start saying the Trinity is foolish nonsense, there's only one God, an argument for Unitarianism, that I would say is heterodoxy. When you start saying Jesus was in fact not divine, he was simply and only a man, maybe a great moral teacher, but nothing else, that's heterodoxy. And Jefferson did both of those. So Jefferson embraced religiously ideas that are heterodox from the perspective of Christian orthodoxy. Yeah, that's it's a very loaded question, and I would say absolutely. I'll suggest one way, and again, it doesn't have to be a thought experiment. We can be empiricist in this respect. Where you look at countries where Protestantism has been dominant, and particularly been dominant for a while, these tend to be countries that are democracies that are free, right? European, at least some European countries, America, and so forth. You keep going. Since Vatican II, this has become more and more true of Roman Catholic countries. When you think of Islamic countries that are democratic and free, as measured by a variety of metrics, right? Freedom House and others, they're very much the exception, and oftentimes where they are the exception, as in the case of Turkey, it's because you have basically a secularist general that imposes that will on the people. Yes, I think it would have been different, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's again a great question. I wouldn't say they're uniquely and distinctly Protestant, but I do think there's things about the Protestant Reformation that lays the groundwork for our sorts of constitutional governments. Just think about some of the great battle cries of the Reformation, the priesthood of all believers, right? We aren't going to have a sacerdotal system where individuals have to go to a priestly caste in order to have access to God. Sola Scriptura, the Scripture alone. And so every individual has a responsibility to go to the Scripture himself or herself to understand God's will for us. We aren't just going to defer to this hierarchy. Well, gosh, if you're going to put these things into practice, what do you have to have? You got to have literacy. And what you see in these Protestant countries is literacy skyrocketed. Probably there was no country or no region as literate as early New England, where you had almost close to universal male literacy. And almost all democratic theorists would say things like literacy are very important for the rise of democracy. And you could keep going, right? Sola fide, faith alone. How does one become a Christian? It's through an individual choice, a choice that can't be compelled by the state. One thing you see within these Protestant countries is they begin to embrace congregational forms of government. Not all Protestants, of course, have this, but a good number do, as represented very well by the Congregationalists in America, where you have people that come together to make decisions about how they're going to govern themselves. Are they going to build a new meeting house? Who are they going to hire for minister? And there's a sense in which you defer to your minister, but there's also a sense in which the minister is accountable to the people. And again, other people in other contexts have pointed, for instance, to the significance of the black church in the antebellum South for helping prepare African Americans for democracy, right? It was the one institution where they had to come together, where they were able to come together to debate things, to discuss things, to make decisions, and empowers people. Yes, I think there's clear connections going on here, clear and deep connections. I of course, do think you can have democracy stem out of other traditions, and certainly we see very healthy democracies developing in other countries, sometimes imposed, as in the case of Japan. Korea is an interesting example, right? The initial Korean Declaration of Independence, I think a third of the signers of that were Christians in an era where very few Koreans were Christians. And as Korea has become more Christian, you see democracy taking root in important ways. So I think they're important, important connections. Yes, sir. Oh, that's a huge question, so I'm going to duck part of it. I just don't know the case of South Africa well enough to really comment on it. To bring it back to something I do know, I think maybe what might be analogous is to slavery in the American South, which was certainly defended by Christians, including Presbyterians, right? I think oftentimes it wasn't as uncritically defended as we sometimes assume. Oftentimes these Presbyterian ministers were really getting after slave owners to treat their slaves in an appropriate manner. And of course, if you keep, and this is one of the hard doctrines of Christianity, right? The hard realities. If you take the scriptures seriously, gosh, they just don't seem to condemn slavery, right? Paul sends an Onesimus back to his Onesimus is a slave, right? Back to Philemon, the master. Slaves are told to obey their master. And so you got a scriptural case for slavery. Of course, you can attack that based on all persons being images of God and the effects of slavery, maybe chattel slavery being different than others. I think if one part of the answer is just simply self-interest, right? Oftentimes, self-interest can override what we should believe or know or do. I think that's part of it. I would point out as well that sometimes it just takes time to work out the implications of these things. And within the American South and the American North, you of course had the abolitionist movement that was driven by Christian convictions. You're certainly right; these really pick up speed in the Second Great Awakening, where you have a much more Armenian form of Christianity than a Calvinism, which has begun to fade. From my perspective, I'd like to think it's sort of the logical outworkings of Christians thinking about how to apply scriptures to matters of public concern. Yeah, I'm not sure if that helps. I would say, again, to go back to the founding era, you see a lot of folks, and particularly New England, and it's a little tricky, right? Because slavery was never as economically significant in New England and the North as it was in the South. But between 1776 and 1808, I guess it is, something like 7 or 8 states abolished slavery, freeing 100,000 people. And I think that was oftentimes motivated by Christian concerns and commitments. Congress, of course, banned the slave trade as soon as it could in 1808. So I think those ideas are out there. To the extent to which Christians didn't rush to embrace them, my best explanation would be self-interest. Okay, yeah, I think that's a wonderful series of questions, and I could get at a couple of them. Let me begin by my characterization of the literature, and I can send you a separate paper I've written where I pull out quotes from all these guys, from Lambert. You see this time and time again. You see it in Lambert, you see it in Gosted, you see it in Holmes and others, where you read through their books. David Holmes is a great example of this. You have a chapter on Washington, a chapter on Jefferson, chapter on Madison, chapter on Hamilton, chapter on Paine, and then usually a chapter saying, in 3 Orthodox Christians. And what you see then is a real emphasis. Okay, look, here's Jefferson, clearly with these heretical views. Here's Franklin is in that. Franklin, clearly heretical views. Tom Paine, Age of Reason, clearly heretical views. You got Washington, you're exactly right. Washington uses Jesus once in his correspondence. I'll address the other God works argument in a minute. He also cites Scripture all the time. He cites Micah 4:4 50 times without attribution, something historians who don't know the Bible, like Ed Morgan, just simply missed. Ed Morgan says there's no evidence that Washington knows Scripture or uses Scripture. 50 times one verse, Micah 4:4. His letter to the Hebrew congregation, 9 distinct scriptural references. So yeah, I'm not sure what to read it. When I say there's no evidence, what I mean is this. Not routinely saying Jesus is not evidence that one is a deist. Find me one piece of evidence, one shred, one place in a private letter, a public correspondence, or whatever, where Washington embraces something heterodoxical or deistic. And providence, my goodness, Washington is always talking about God intervening in the affairs of men and nations. Again, people talk about deists that allow for God to intervene in the affairs of men and nations. And if that's included within your definition of deism, you could say, well, perhaps he's that sort of deist. But still, I'd be interested, where does he reject any core element of traditional Christianity? And if your argument simply is he doesn't say Jesus a lot, I find that to be a pretty weak read. The other God words, this is an intriguing argument. You hear it all the time, right? Supreme being, creator, words like this. I did a fun little study where I went through the Westminster Catechism, and you find these words all over the place, right? God is referred to in this way all the time. And so I'm not sure in the context of the Declaration, I'm not sure in the context of Washington that's necessarily evidence of deism. Yes, and again, yeah, I'll even, I like Mark Knoll. He's one of my favorite historians. He wrote the preface to the Forgotten Founders in Religion and Public Life. He was one of the outside reviewers. I think he's changed a good bit but if you, on this subject, but if you go back to something like The Search for Christian America, he does the same thing. He focuses in on a Jefferson, on a Madison, on a Paine, on a Franklin. And my contention is these folks are profoundly unrepresentative. You think about the 5 or 6 famous founders we look at, with the exception of John Adams, they're all Anglicans. In a couple of cases, they're foreigners. Tom Paine, who spent most of his life in England or in Europe, a son of some sort of odd Quaker Anglican mix, comes over here. You know, clearly he's not a representative American in the Age of Reason. When the Age of Reason comes out, Americans go ballistic, and a number of folks, you know, write responses to it. Right, Patrick Henry, who else? Not Elias Boudinot, but these other folks. Yes, I just want to, I think there's a lot of bad history out there. Why they do that is it's an interesting question. I do think as Mark Knoll and these guys have grown as historians, they are less likely to do these errors. But you still see it. Lambert's a great example. You read through that, he focuses in on these 5 or so founders almost extensively. And I think it's just bad history. You know, I have looked into that, and one thing that's just mind-boggling is it's almost impossible to find a Reformed clergy who opposes a war for independence. One famous example is a fellow named Zubli, who was actually from Switzerland, came over here. He's actually initially very much on the side of what we'd call the Patriots, but when push came to shove, he said, you know, we just can't go this far. So there are exceptions, some Dutch Reform types in New Jersey, but they're very, you know, so it's, gosh, it's hard to quantify, but you might say 98% of Reformed clergy supported the Patriot side, oftentimes very actively. With respect to Anglican clergy, it's my understanding that it's more like 50%, so it's much more split, as you might imagine. A fellow named Boucher has a wonderful essay that I have my students read. I mean, it's just really fantastic, where he says basically, look, Romans 13 says you have to obey the government. If you don't like it, you can appeal. If you don't get granted the appeal, you suffer the consequences. One of the things that's fun about that is he actually goes on to say, not only are these Presbyterians wrong, but so is John Locke. John Locke's wrong. John Filmer has it right. You know, there's no right to revolution. So yeah, these guys did exist. And you might expect more heavily in the Church of England clergy, right? But the Reformed clergy are pretty solidly on the other side. And it's interesting, you know, I think it raises questions, why is this the case? Because certainly you can't think of probably almost any political issue where clergy would be so much on one side today. I'll begin with the first one. I think it's a sensible way of approaching the question. I just think it's almost meaningless to say almost all Americans in this era would have identified themselves as Christian. Yes, they would have. I think we can all agree on that. So what? If that's what makes it a Christian founding, it's just not interesting. And then, you know, problems with sincerity and so forth. So in my mind, and this fits within the project of historians and political scientists and law professors that work in the American founding all the time. We're arguing about who influenced the founders and which influences were more important than others. And I suppose what I'm arguing is not only was Christianity an influence, it was a very significant influence, and in fact perhaps far more important than many of these other things that are out there. And I think it's an important historical argument to make, if even just for understanding our own history better. But absolutely, we have to recognize that Blackstone was influential and Montesquieu was influential. Thinkers from the Scottish Enlightenment were influential. The Scottish Enlightenment, remember, is far more compatible with Christianity than, say, the radical continental Enlightenment. I do think, though, here's where I think historians see things as too messy. They love seeing things as messy and complicated and so forth. But I think the American founding is perhaps messy in the same way that African American voting behavior is messy. Yes, there's African Americans that vote Republican, there's African Americans that vote Democratic, and there's African Americans that vote Green Party. There's an African American who ran for, vice president on the Communist Party ticket. So it's kind of messy, but it really isn't. Most African Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic. At least they vote Democratic when push comes to shove. And to pretend it's just a messy story is really pretty misleading. And so, yeah, that's one of my arguments. There's a good book recently by a Californian political scientist where he did a historiography of the American founding. You can go through and read about the various possible influences on the American founders: Lockean liberalism, classical republicanism, Scottish Enlightenment, multiple traditions, right? The Kansas University Press, pretty big book. Christianity is not a chapter. Christianity is one little footnote. And some authors like Barry Allen Shane have argued that Christianity had an influence. So yeah, part of the argument is to say, hey, it's a matter of intellectual influence. We need to understand this is a very important influence that should be taken seriously. Generally, historians get this better than political scientists and law professors. Let me just say that up front. Now, in terms of reclaiming, I'm not so sure it is important to reclaim. And in fact, part of my argument was it's really difficult to get at sincerity. I think the main thing I'm doing here is I'm pushing back. You see all the time. Lambert says it, David Holmes says it, Jeffrey Stone says it, Edwin Gostin says this. He does say this. Most or many of the founders were deists. All right, so you make a claim like that. That claim requires evidence. What's your evidence that they were deists? Right? There are two founders that are public deists. Really two, I think. Ethan Allen and Tom Paine. Tom Paine's an Englishman, a son of a Quaker and Episcopalian, with a really odd path. I'm not even sure we should count him as an American. There are two American founders that are public deists. Ben Franklin, it's true, as a very young man, publishes an essay where he basically denies that there's good and evil. But right away he recognizes this is stupid. I shouldn't teach these doctrines. He tries to get him back and so forth. And that's not a deistic document either. So again, where does Ben Franklin publicly embrace deistic values? You just don't find it. This is public. If we turn to private, we know for sure that a Thomas Jefferson, a John Adams, and a handful of others, I can maybe get to 5 or so, clearly rejected tenets of Orthodox Christianity. So that's it. We're up to about 7 now that are clearly heterodox in some way, privately or publicly. And all the rest it's not clear. I challenge you. I've asked a number of people who know this stuff well. Give me one sentence from Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, or George Washington where these folks reject a tenet of Orthodox Christianity. No one's ever been able to do that. Right? Instead, people say, well, Madison apparently didn't attend church, and Washington's church attendance was spotty. Washington didn't say Jesus a lot. Well, fine. That's not evidence of deism. So I guess what I'm doing there is I'm attacking a claim that's often made. And again, I think it's useful. If I want to say, if I come here and I say Barack Obama is a Muslim, you would be very reasonable to say, what's your evidence of that? Right? So yeah, I think it's a response to something you see all the time out there. But yeah, I'm not really all that interested in the personal piety of James Madison. Does that help? Does that make sense?